Hi everybody, welcome to all of you who are able to join us for the second session of our webinar, Moving Towards Generational Healing. Session 2 will be focused on the reality of loss. I do have to say again that I have no financial arrangements or affiliations with any commercial entities, and we will continue to the actual content. So our goals this week will be to discuss the variety of possible reactions and responses to the loss of a Holocaust survivor, because there are many different possible reactions that people experience and have reported to me over the years. We will try to relate the particular responses that people have to issues that have been identified as common concerns of Holocaust survivors' children. Just one second, and to identify how these color the way that we respond to such a life crisis. We will also use these themes to discuss how being raised by survivor parents may have colored our concept and our attitudes about death in very unique ways and with very unique anxieties that are not necessarily shared by other people, other adult children who face the loss of their aging parents. So I will start by the fact that it is rather, I think, obvious when one meets with children of survivors that we have a unique familiarity with death. It has been something that has been sort of hanging in our family atmosphere from the time that we know ourselves. It is woven into all kinds of small comments and responses. And yet it is a familiarity not with natural death, but with a catastrophic, premature murder of people who were supposed to still have a long life ahead of them. So consequently, the feelings that we have about the death and the decline, the illness and the death of a survivor parent might be very difficult feelings, very much saturated with traumatic associations and traumatic reactions that have been tainted with these previous experiences that we have about death, when death is mentioned, when death is faced. And by the way, it is also very important to notice that for most of us children of survivors, I certainly can speak for myself, there was no experience of natural death in the near circles where we grew up until we were quite older, because our parents were, for the most part, at least young adults by the time, not older than that, by the time they'd experienced the war. So older adults did not tend to survive quite as frequently, and so there were no grandparents around. There was no observation of that until our own parents began to age and ail. Murder, the way that the families of our parents died, is a catastrophic event that our parents have managed to somehow miraculously escape when most people did not. So they have this kind of an ability, in some sense, in our eyes, that other people did not have somehow, a miraculous capacity to victor over death. But this time, when facing natural death, our parents, the survivors, cannot triumph over the natural processes. And that is a very difficult discrepancy, a very difficult cognitive dissonance for us to, I think, really make sense of emotionally. Given the emotional suffering of the parents, the enormity of their losses, the enormity of what they've been through for such a long time as some of them had to endure, it also seems to us, I don't mean rationally and fully consciously, but I think on a very profound implicit level, children of survivors feel that their survivor parents deserve more than one lifetime, more than the natural lifetime to make up for it. And yet their time is running out or has run out, and that is also something that we somehow have very difficult feelings about, feelings of injustice, feelings of it just can't be this way. It wasn't enough. We didn't manage to give them enough. They didn't manage to enjoy enough. They deserve so much more to make up for what they lost in their lifetime. And also, given the past suffering and indignities that were so cruelly and sadistically bestowed upon the parents during the Holocaust, the experience that we have in watching them have to suffer the indignities of illness and of old age and everything that's associated with that, all of that seems very cruel and unjust as well. Another theme that is very powerfully interwoven into the responses of children of survivors to the death of the parents has to do with our lifelong feeling of responsibility for the well-being of the parents. We touched upon it last time. We see a certain kind of role reversal in that sense in the relationship between children of Holocaust survivors, and now we have seen it also in other families where parents were exposed to extreme traumatization. Children develop this inordinate concern for their parents' well-being, as Fields expressed it when he looked at families of children and parents who suffered persecution in South Asia. That kind of extraordinary awareness for the parents' past losses and suffering makes it very important to prevent any kind of additional suffering and a sense of deep commitment and responsibility to be able to do that, to try to do that. So the helplessness that is sometimes inevitable in the face of the parents' decline, in the face of the parents' death, in the face of some of the shortcomings of healthcare providers or the perceived shortcomings of healthcare providers, can invoke intense feelings of guilt, depression even, anger, a profound sense of injustice, and for some children of survivors, a lot of ambivalence because of the complicated relationship that they might have had with their parents, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So one reason why it is very important for us, or you may ask why it is so important for us to talk in the context of the reactions to the parents dying and death and dying about the prevalent themes in the life of the second generation. And the answer to that, it's a very good question. And the answer to that is that the themes that were related to effects of our parents' trauma on the way that we related to them, on the way that they related to us, on the way we perceived them, all of these themes throughout life that were embedded in the relationship with parents who suffered so much, these themes have become sort of the way we are not only with relation to our parents, but the way we respond to things in life, the way we interpret things that happen to us, the meanings that we make of various things in our own life. It is now the way we are. And in order to be able to then take a step back and recognize how we tend to take things, and that this is our way of taking things because of certain themes that were very powerful in our in the context of our family, in the context of our relationship with our parents, in the context of intergenerational trauma. That allows us, actually recognizing that, allows us to take a step back and think about it in a different way, and think about it as one way in which we could respond if we feel terribly guilty or if we feel terribly ambivalent. We can understand why, and we can try to make a different meaning to our, and sort of examine our responses as one set of possible responses, and recognize that we can perhaps focus on other feelings, other perceptions that are also possible, and have different responses which may be beneficial for us. So some of the common psychological concerns that I chose to point in this context are the emotional impact that many children of survivors describe to moments in which they actually experience the parents, directly observe the parents, become very emotionally upset, very emotionally dysregulated because they were triggered by something. These moments are seared into people's brains because children are exquisitely sensitive to moments where they experience their parent as either very frightened or very frightening to them. These are moments that create very powerful memories that are very painful for many children, and can really detract from the sense of safety and warmth in the relationship with the parent, contributing to a great deal of ambivalence in those relationships. That ambivalence, in turn, will then perhaps come up in the context of caring for the parent when the parent is very needy and perhaps demanding and ill, and needing the child to be there, and also might color the feelings about all of these issues we're discussing around death and dying. Some children of survivors will also discuss moments where they experience their parent as very emotionally numb and detached, when it would have been appropriate for the parent to be a lot more excited, a lot more engaged, a lot more involved in some particularly meaningful moment in the child's life, like when the child got a great grade, or the child made it into some sports team that was important to them, or even responses that I heard to hearing that the child is pregnant, or hearing that the child is having a problem. It could also be not just positive moments, but difficult moments that failed to engage sufficient emotional responsivity from the parent, and the child felt very hurt, very disappointed by the parent's detachment and numbness. It is also important to know that both dysregulation, so moments when the parent is very triggered and explosive, or crying, or very upset, those moments of what we call emotional dysregulation, and I will show in a minute an example of it from a movie about a child survivor. Both the dysregulation and the emotional numbing and detachment at moments that are significant to the child can coexist in the same parent. It may sound paradoxical, but it really isn't, because the emotional dysregulation occurs when the parent is triggered by something, and the numbing and the detachment is more typical as a state of lower responsivity to what otherwise should be positive things, and sort of the way that we would expect someone who is more engaged in our lives to respond. Other people, perhaps related to these things, other people describe a sense of lack of sufficient ability in their parents to provide emotional support. As I said, in difficult moments in particular, and a sense that their problems were never seen as serious enough by the parents, given the fact that everything was compared to the experience of the parent during the Holocaust. So, for example, someone going into a minor surgery whose parent is there supposedly to support them, but then the parent spends their entire time talking to the nurse about their own Holocaust experiences, or a parent who comes to be with the child because a friend abandoned them in their rented apartment, which was supposed to be rented together, and didn't say anything, just disappeared, but then says, don't make too much of it, in comparison to losing one's entire family, what does it really matter? And it really makes the child feel that whatever happens in their own life, whatever problem, disappointment, pain they're experiencing in this moment is really trivial and has no really importance. So what is very, very important is for me to emphasize is that we really must listen to every individual amongst us, and that some children of survivors really did have it much harder than others, and they feel that their story is not accepted by the rest of us, by children of survivors who maybe don't want to be bundled together with those of us whose stories are particularly painful. And it may very well be that many of us do not want to be considered part of that group whose parents are described as lacking in parental warmth or ability to sufficiently support their children. It seems perhaps that it would imply that all Holocaust survivors were injured and not well. And I think that is a generalization, an overgeneralization that we certainly need to avoid. But there are certainly many children of survivors who did have difficult experiences, and it's very important that we listen to all of these experiences respectfully and accept our own experience, whichever it is, for whatever it is, and not add self-deprecation to it. I would like to show you a little snippet, if we manage to get it to work, of a documentary called Mr. Rakovsky.
There was nobody like my father. Nobody. He saved my mother's life 6 times.
Tell him to raise the volume. Raise your volume if you can.
How do you have a relationship with other human beings? He's clueless. Clueless. Doesn't know what to do.
I was thinking of it today. The pain, the terrible pains.
My mother had the same experiences. She's been turned into ice. I know plenty of other Holocaust survivors. They didn't turn into ice. What are you doing? Going to New York and coming right back?
He was well with him. I had to work with the boy.
You were proud of him?
Yeah.
But you never told him. The most horrible thing you can do to a person. The most horrible thing you can do to a person. Never forgive him for that. Never, ever.
In a moment like this, you not think what you say.
That has nothing to do with war. Nothing.
So as you can see, there are moments like that, and some of us can be very successful in many ways, as Mr. Rakovsky's son is, and yet carry very difficult memories and very difficult, vulnerable fragments that complicate their relationship with with a parent that they may admire in many, many other ways. I want to recommend to you a book called A Thread of Grace by Maria Doria Russell. And I apologize for the mistake in the way I missed an L in her name on this slide. It's a book that describes the story of a protagonist, a girl, during the Holocaust, and we get to gain a very intimate and very, very close relationship and understanding to this girl and what she suffered and what she lost. And then at the very, very end of the book, we read about the experiences and the feelings that her children have about her as she's at the end of her life. And I quote from the book, "This is what they remember from their mother. She never cried. Each of her children tells of some life crisis that failed to arouse maternal compassion. The cancer, the divorce, the miscarriage. In their mother's opinion, nothing of what happened in Canada can ever justify crying. Save your tears," she used to say. "You might need them sometime." And I continue to quote, "Hospice rabbis learn a lot about the families they serve. In the long hours it takes for old bodies to die, gray-haired children exchange place by their parents' bedside. Some are wholeheartedly dedicated, feeling the pain of the impending loss, but determined to make these last few hours comfortable and peaceful. Others do their duty in hope of mitigating guilt feelings which will trouble them after the death. Others are frustrated, almost angry at the dying parent, desperate to understand the forces which distorted their childhood. This is their last opportunity to understand, and it is slipping away from them." This is what we are trying to do here together, is understand these forces that shaped our childhood and shaped who we have become and shaped why and how we respond the way we do to the end of our parents' lives. So quickly, just going through some of the facts that are important and relevant, is that we do see that symptoms in Holocaust survivors persisted for many decades, in many, many of them. A meta-analysis of 71 studies of Holocaust survivors showed that symptoms persisted. I will show you the graph in a minute, both in clinical samples, namely people who sought therapy in some form during their lifetime, and in non-clinical samples, namely survivors who lived in the community and never sought any type of mental health assistance. Higher rates of all kinds of symptoms, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, have actually been shown in those who were children during World War II in Europe in many, many multiple samples, including Finnish children that were evacuated and separated from their families, British children that were evacuated from London, German children, and definitely among the Jewish children, as well as now, based on this body of literature, we also see similar things in other more recent trauma-exposed populations. So symptoms persist for decades, and this is the graph that I mentioned. Survivors in this meta-analytic study, a study that compared the results of 71 studies of survivors, showed that they weren't that different from other peers, but the two very high spikes in the center are the spikes for post-traumatic stress symptoms. One of them is for the clinical population, the other one is for the non-clinical population, but that's where you can see that they had a lot more symptoms. And that's many years after the end of the war. We also see that there are two sides of adaptation. The research suggests that people can also have, they can have post-traumatic symptoms, they can have even some pretty severe post-traumatic symptoms alongside the ability to show very positive adaptation and very good coping in many, many areas of their lives. Problems, though, tend to be manifested in the most intimate circles, in the most intimate relationships, spousal and an intergenerational relationship, so the relationship with one's spouse and with one's children. The cost of this adaptive functioning that many survivors of trauma were able to, survivors of the Holocaust were able to show, because there's no question that many of them remained unbelievably productive and able to participate in work and be pro-social members of society. The cost of that adaptive functioning has been termed by some researchers hardening or stealing, which means sort of a certain sealing over of the painful and the terrible memories, and an ability to push forward and move on despite those very, very painful memories. That requires a certain ability to not feel your own pain, to put it away and not feel it so that you can function. It also may have meant that one's ability to be empathic to another person's trials and tribulations and pain, even if it's the normative pain that children may have in response to their growing challenges and the things that we all have to go through in normative development, that maybe the sensitivity, the capacity to be empathic to these pains was also restricted for some people. And we do, as I say, consider this type of intergenerational effects to be historical trauma. We see it now in many different populations. The main body of knowledge about it evolved around and from studies of Holocaust families, but we see it in many other groups. And we also see in more recent trauma studies that look at the children of various people traumatized in recent times, including children after the September 11th catastrophe and all kinds of other things, that when the adult in the family has suffered a trauma, the trauma of the adult affects others. It affects other adults living with that adult, whether it's the parents of that adult and certainly the spouse of that adult, and it affects the children growing up in that family. The children of adults who suffer from post-traumatic stress symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are at a higher risk for various types of psychopathology, even when the child, like the children of survivors, was not at all exposed to the same trauma. So what we see that these symptoms of hyperarousal in the parent, just like I said before, and like you will see in a snippet from the movie Fugitive Pieces that I will share in a minute, hyperarousal are moments when the parent is triggered and responds in some disproportionately emotional way, mostly negative emotional way, to something that appears relatively minor and unexpected. So moments like that and moments of detachment or the inability to be sufficiently excited and attuned and happy, or sufficiently supportive and empathic to some significant event or moment in the child's life, those symptoms, which are clearly symptoms of post-traumatic reactions, were seen in many studies to be something that really detracts from the intimacy, the emotional intimacy, both in the spousal relationships and in the relationship with the children. And they are related, as I said before, to poor mental health in the children. So I want you to notice in the snippet that I'm going to try and show you the sharp change in the emotional tone. There is a child and a father. They seem very close. There's a warmth there. There's a nice feeling there. And all of a sudden, it changes dramatically in a split second because the father is triggered by the child's behavior. So that's what I would like you to pay attention to as a manifestation of what I talked about. Make it as loud as you can.
Hey, what's this? Isn't that for food? Why do you throw it away? Take it. Take it. Join the war. Everything in that, no matter how small, about pencil, school, not to mention the things that could make you weak. A good pair of shoes, hot water, spare food. It's not the right chicken. Now my own son throws away that. Yes. Son doesn't even understand the value of things, so I really survive.
So parental exposure, or parents' exposure to the trauma that they suffered, has been seen to be associated in the children with also some biological, biopsychological effects or markers that make us a little different, or make many of us a little different from other people whose parents were not exposed to the trauma of the Holocaust. And we believe that both features of the relationship with the parents and biological processes are involved in creating these differences. And since we do seem to have biological markers that suggest that we have a vulnerability to a more marked stress response, our stress response may be greater or accentuated to the crisis of the illness and the death of the parents than other people's. So there's even an interesting hypothesis that maternal that exposure to the trauma, so our mother's exposure to the trauma, is related to something that changes the environment during pregnancy and impacts the child that is born. And we also see that second generation in midlife, as we are now aging ourselves, seem to suffer from more physical problems, which may be related to the trauma that our parents suffered during the war. So another area that can cause great pain and great distress around the death and the dying of the parents is the fact that Holocaust survivors have been seen in some studies to be more difficult patients, or to be perceived by their care providers as difficult patients. And that makes sense. I say sometimes to people, if you recall the movie Born on the 4th of July that shows the veteran from Vietnam as a young veteran, and how clearly he suffers from PTSD. Imagine that man 40 years later as an aging or ailing and aging man, and how clear it would be to see him as a difficult patient. Well, not all Holocaust survivors are difficult patients, but certainly some of them have been shown to be perceived this way. In a study from Israel, in a study from Los Angeles, in both cases, they were seen to be more aggressive, more belligerent. Some refuse to connect. They have more suspiciousness. They are less trusting of their caretaker. They have a lot of hypervigilance. They sometimes express open xenophobia, bitterness, entitlement, and can be, on the other hand, others may be extremely needy, very afraid of authority, very much in need of sort of getting the people in authority to be kind to them by being very needy and very and trying to buy, if you like, positive regard in various ways, more or less appropriate. All of these things can lead to or exacerbate difficulties in the relationship between the aging and ailing Holocaust survivor and the healthcare providers, especially when survivors suffer from some cognitive impairment already. And it can also make it much harder for the children of survivors to provide the best care for their parents, or it may leave the children of survivors feeling guilty for the fact that they didn't manage to somehow overcome these difficulties, explain their parents better to their care providers, and get them or garnish for them the best care that they deserve and that they wanted to get them. So what is trauma? Trauma, according to the definition of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency, is an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting effects on the individual's functioning in physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So these are the 3 E's as they are referred to: the event itself, the subjective experience that we have of that event, and the effects, the lasting effects that we carry with us of that event. And in that sense, I believe that many of us have a lot of traumatic residues around our parents dying, our parents' process of dying, and our parents' death. And I would like us to be able to have a bit of a discussion about it. I hope that that would be possible for us in a couple of minutes when I stop. So again, I think that writing is therapeutic, very therapeutic for us, and a couple of points that I suggest either for thinking or for writing after this session are: what would you like to tell your parent or the person that you lost if you could communicate with them now? Is there something that you didn't get to fully express while they were alive? Is there something that you couldn't say then? What would you like to say now? And another point is, what would your parent or your loved one wish for you today if they could see you now? I am inviting you to, I will stop now, and I'm inviting you to send your comments and your questions, anything that you would like to express. And some of the suggested issues might include comments or whatever you would like to share about the process by which your significant person passed away, and how you express your personal reactions and feelings about the loss that you experienced. And I also want to mention that I invite all of you who would like to show photographs of their loved one whom they lost in the next meeting. We'll figure out how to include that in the presentation if you would like. So there are some additional resources that I am going to send, and the slides are going to be sent to you. So at this point, I am opening the discussion for the group. Thank you very much for being with us again today.
Thank you, Irit. Hi, everybody. This is Toby Weiss from MJHS Hospice and Palliative Care. Irit, as always, the information resonates deeply. It's very powerful. To the audience of participants that have logged in, I want you to know that links to the videos will be shared and sent out to all that registered, whether you're on today or not. And Irit, in light of the fact that the sound was not where it should be, there was some sort of glitch. Some people have written in and asked if you might be able to elaborate briefly on what the videos showed.
Of course. So the first video, the snippet from the documentary Mr. Rakowski, shows essentially, it shows a lot of things, but what I wanted to highlight in this particular context is just a couple of things. The obvious ambivalence and deep pain expressed by the son, who's clearly a very successful man in many external measures, but expresses also a very deep pain and vulnerability around his relationship with his father and something that happened between them which he finds so hurtful that he can't forgive his father for. And at the same time, you see his caring for his father and his concern for his father's well-being. You also see there a complicated statement where he says, you know, I know other survivors and they didn't turn into ice, and it had nothing to do with the war, whatever it is that he's holding his father responsible for and feels that it was such a negative aspect of his father. I think that's a complicated statement, and I want to highlight the fact that we really cannot make that statement about any survivor. We don't know what they would have been like because people have very different responses to the same traumatic event. And some people can experience, so to speak, the same event, which is also very hard to really say, but some people can be present or experience a very similar event, and each of them will respond differently and will have different effects of that event. And some will have lifelong lasting events, and some will have less. So what I wanted to show was the complexity of the relationship. On one hand, the admiration for his father's capacity to have saved his mother 6 times during the war, and on the other hand, the sense of the hurt in the relationship. And that's a great manifestation for what I spoke about when I said that parents could be both. They could have very severe post-traumatic effects and symptoms, such as, you know, either explosions and rageful explosions, or frightening or frightened moments. And alongside those, they could have numbness and detachment, or what this person perhaps referred to when he said, my father turned to ice. Other survivors did not turn to ice. So all of these things are what I wanted to show, and sort of, I think they capture the complexity of some of the relationships that children of survivors have with their parents. The other video is a snippet from the film that is available also for commercial watching, called Fugitive Pieces. The film describes a young boy, that's the young man who sits there in the first scene of this snippet. He was found by a Greek archaeologist who was doing some work in Poland in the woods, and he smuggled him out of Poland during the war and raised him as his son. And then they immigrated from Greece after the war to New York, and they live in New York, and they make very close relationships with this family, a couple of survivors and their young son. And the snippet that I show opens as they are all sitting there in the living room of the couple after the funeral of the Greek archaeologist who passed away. And the little boy is sitting there with his dad, and you can see the warmth and the cuddling and the comfort and the safety of the relationship between them, which is destroyed in a second when the father is triggered by the fact that this young boy got bored with the conversation of the adults and is leaving his half-eaten apple on the side as he wants to go and play. For the father who experienced such starvation in the concentration camp, this is a very powerful trigger, and he responds, and you can see the disproportionate response and the fear that it invokes in the child. And you can imagine that if things like that happen in the course of this child's growing up in this family, how it completely destroys the sense of safety and the warmth that was there initially in the beginning of the snippet when we see the child and the dad sitting this way. The unpredictability of such moments completely destroys the safety of the relationship. That's what the second video attempted to show.
Thank you, Irit. So some comments and questions have come in. First, the easy one. Somebody's asking, what is the name of the book you recommended? It is A Thread of Grace by Doria Russell.
Hi, Maria.
Correct?
Maria Doria Russell,
Maria.
and Russell is spelled Russell, and I translated freely from the Hebrew version, which I read, but it exists also in English.
Thank you. Okay, so now some of the questions and comments. One question to start with. If numbing and detachment is a dysregulated response to trauma, how does the child recognize that same dysregulated response in themselves? How does the second generation child deliberately self-regulate and change this response pattern?
That's a very, very good question. And I think that this is what I'm hoping will happen, is that we will take these themes that we now recognize and use them for self-examination. So if we, let's say, had a very strong reaction, let's say that we think that a healthcare provider has not responded well enough to a need of our parent, or maybe they really didn't even, were convinced that they didn't do the right thing. If we perhaps have an exaggerated response, whether in terms of being dysregulated in our response to that healthcare provider, or whether that dysregulation is turned against ourselves, that is something that we need to look at from a certain distance and say, is that perhaps that kind of an instance? Can I maybe look at it a little bit in that context and sort of mitigate that reaction? Is there another way of looking at it? Is there another way of feeling it? Because as soon as we begin to examine our feelings and our responses, we sort of have a chance of not taking it as the only way that it has to be, that it simply is this way. As soon as we begin to think about it, we can maybe find some additional ways of looking at it that we did not see before. Maybe it's not quite as cruel and terrible and uncaring. Maybe that healthcare provider meant well. Maybe they were busy. Maybe, maybe we did our best. Maybe we can find other ways to look at our own behavior. So it just provides us with some flexibility to not be, if you like, in that moment and think of it and feel it as the only option. For example, if you take the moment with the dad, if dad in that snippet could have been in treatment, perhaps, could have had the opportunity to do what we're trying to do now with ourselves, could he then stop himself the next time when he feels that rising feeling in himself? Could he stop himself and say, wait a second, it's just an apple. We're not in the war. This is New York. He's 6 years old. He wants to go to play. And I can tell you that actually I saw this happen in reality for parents who are in treatment with me, mothers who are in treatment, who are widows of September 11. And they were part of an intervention devised by a team led by Dr. Beatrice Beebe. And they really changed. They were actually, videos were used of them freely interacting with their children and then discussed with them. And I could see over time tremendous changes where a parent was able to think in the moment as they were triggered and change their way of relating to their child, even though they were very traumatized, obviously, the widows. So we can also do the same for ourselves. And that's what we try to do when we go to therapy. That's what we try to do in these kinds of, engaging in these kinds of discussions amongst ourselves, how to be able to know that we have certain hot buttons, that we need to examine our responses to other people and also our responses to ourselves, because like I said, Many children of survivors walk around with tremendous guilt feelings, depressive experiences, and very difficult other emotions related to what we did or didn't do, feel or didn't feel around the process of our parents' death.
Thank you. Your comments dovetail incredibly well with some of the comments that we received in a two-part question. So let me share with you some of the comments, and then I'll ask another question. One of the comments is, among the immediate reactions to my mother's death was, one, absolutely, for all of my grief, the certainty that she was with her family, finally. She had missed them all her life. Now finally she was with them. Second, that she actually lived out her life and died in a normal way. I had the same reaction when a cousin of hers died. Also, after living out his life, he died, for heaven's sake, not murdered. He has a grave. The next comment, also powerful, also resonates strongly with everything you just said. Thank you for showing and defining the extent of the trauma that our parents carried with them throughout their lives and how they impacted often negatively on ours. It is allowing me to overcome the pain caused to me by the parents and to forgive them, even posthumously. And then the question, is it common for children of survivors to close themselves off emotionally from their parents in order to protect their own identity and individuality? And the second part to that question, I had real trouble feeling compassion toward what my mother was going through at the end of her life, but I was tormented by the thought of her pain until the end and even now. What can you respond?
So I certainly feel that the first part is very, very common. You know, a lot of people did have to sort of close themselves off to their parents in order to prevent the pervasive sense of having to put parents' needs and wishes ahead of their own, because sometimes in order to prevent parents from feeling anxiety and pain, one would have to just avoid doing a lot of normative things that were critical for one's own normative development. So many children will describe that, you know, I'll give you an example, and there are many, many such examples. One patient who said, who grew up in Israel and said to me, you know, our schools would always have an annual trip, which was like a few days of hiking somewhere going somewhere further away from the town that you were living in, and hiking somewhere in nature and sleeping away. And she said every year there would be a whole week before the trip in which my mother and I would cry. She would cry because she couldn't bear the thought that I would go, and her anxieties and her worries, and I would cry that I want to go. And every year in the end, I went. That patient or that person, for example, managed to shut herself off, to close herself off to her mother's anxieties, and recognize that she needs to do her thing, that she does not need to give up the trip in order to prevent her mother from experiencing the anxieties that she did. That's a very difficult thing to do for a child, but in the context of such massive parental trauma, some were able to do it, some were less able to do it, and it was really the rational thing to do was to behave like a normative child and do the things that are considered normative, and not avoid doing things because we don't want to trigger disproportionate anxieties and pain that are due to events that are not really relevant to the here and now reality, but very painful for the parents. So that's the kind of closing off that children had to do in order to be able to individuate, to do the things that were appropriate in their context of the here and now where they were growing, and not to be impacted or overly impacted by post-traumatic worries and anxieties and attempts to protect the parent. That's maybe my part answer to the first question and to the first part of the question. The second one, could you quickly remind me what was the second one?
Yes, the second part of the question was, I had real trouble feeling compassion toward what my mother was going through at the end of her life, but I was tormented by the thought of her pain until the end and even now.
Exactly, and that's the ambivalence that I touched upon, that some of us have to deal with, and it's so important to understand and to forgive oneself, to understand the sources of the ambivalence, to understand that when a child grows up with all of these difficult aspects of the relationship with some of the parents, like the child in this movie, Fugitive Pieces. In the movie, you see this child when he has grown up to be a young man, and he essentially speaks very harshly of his father, and also sort of expresses a difficulty being compassionate to what his father was experiencing. We have to forgive ourselves for that, recognizing from the current position of mature adults that for a child growing up with these types of experiences, it's very understandable that the child has to shut themselves off from some of it, and that the child does not have compassion or cannot have compassion for that because the child themselves were deprived of competent, compassionate, attuned experiences in the parenting that they experienced. There's no denying that for some of the children. And even though we now understand that this was not because of some character flaw of our parents, and certainly not because of some character flaw of the child who didn't deserve to be better loved or better treated, even though we now understand it, it still colored very deeply the immediate, implicit way that we felt about that parent and about ourselves. And that's what needs to be now gradually changed by understanding the context, and perhaps through that understanding, we can now as adults work to at least posthumously forgive the parent, and most importantly, forgive ourselves.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, it is now 1:29. I want to know if you have any closing remarks, and are there any homework assignments, if you will, or things you want to leave the participants with for the next session, which will be held on Monday, November 5th, same time, 12:30 to 1:30. And I want to invite everyone who is online to please encourage those that you know who have expressed interest in registering. Even if they cannot participate live, they'll be able to see the recorded sessions afterward. And the one person sent in her 6-word description. Maybe there's a way that we could have others send those in prior to the next session.
That would be great. So in terms of something to do, I go back to what I suggested, these 2 points to think about or to write about. And if you would like to share them with me, you can send them, and I'll be very, very appreciative and very happy to read them. And like I said, if you would like to share photographs, then please let us know, and I'll speak with my colleagues here as to how we can do that, photographs of your loved one. I will continue to, we will continue to relate to many of the themes that we talked about in the next sessions, but I'm hoping that they sort of build up on top of each other. And I thank you all very, very much again for being with me today, with us, and hope to reconvene 2 weeks from now. Thank you.